Hello and welcome. My guest today is Andrij Dobriansky, Director of Communication at the Ukrainians Congress Committee of America. Andrij, thank you so much for joining us again.
And thank you for having me again.
So, Macron says Trump finally got that Putin lied to him about peace in Ukraine. Okay, and what now?
Reminds everybody of the moment when Steve Witkoff, the special representative to Russia, as well as the Middle East and Iran, when he had what he thought negotiated a ceasefire with Israel and Hamas, only to declare 1 week later that Hamas lied to him and he was surprised at this. So this is very much in line with the Trump administration, declaring things that the rest of the world readily knows. We know that Putin is a liar. We know that he's a war criminal. And we know that he needs to be not only stopped, but he needs to be prosecuted for a fair and just peace. The problem with these kind of realizations and finding hope in them is the fact that President Trump vacillates a lot in terms of his personal demeanor, and his personal reaction is how he dictates a lot of his policy. So while he may be upset one day, as he was over a month ago when he declared on social media Vladimir stop, that quickly turned to further declarations of the possibility of working with Russia. And as we know, that up until this moment, we still have negotiations going on between Russia and the United States about some kind of potential trade deal. So no matter what President Trump declares, it is really the actions after the fact that we need to see happen. So are there going to be new sanctions? Are there going to be increased weapon systems sent to Ukraine? These are the actions that would show us that there is a change in policy, as opposed to just what we heard when President Trump was at the airport yesterday, as well as his social media declaration as well.
Okay, Trump says Putin has gone totally crazy. At the same time, he blames Zelensky for causing problems. So who's really the problem for Trump here? And does that mean he'll finally get tougher on Putin?
I believe reality is the problem for President Trump. The way the world exists, it does not act in the way that he wants it. This doesn't just apply to the international relations between the United States, Ukraine, and or Russia, but also his approach to international economics and the tariff war, and why aren't prices going in the way he wants. He's very upset at the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, for not listening to him, even though it is a separate entity and declares its own actions by itself. So in this respect, yes, he as soon as he declares his being upset with President Putin, he also must include the fact that President Zelensky doesn't do everything that he wants either. Although we must point out to President Trump, and we activists here in the United States do point out to both the news sources as well as to elected officials that as almost as quickly as President Trump asks for something, Ukraine responds pretty quickly, as opposed to Russia. We must point out that it is President Zelensky who acceded to a full ceasefire, not President Putin. We must point out that even though the coalition of the willing was interested in putting on sanctions as of 2 Mondays ago, it was President Trump who demanded that President Zelensky meet with President Putin in Istanbul, which never ended up happening. But President Zelensky did travel to that country in the middle of a war. So this is something that even though President Trump expresses anger with, it is important that we underscore to his closer allies. And then that we need to hear from his allies specifically. For instance, we heard last night during the bombing that Pastor Burns, the evangelical pastor from South Carolina, who visited Ukraine earlier, who saw the difference, who only realized once he saw with his own eyes what was happening, and then came back and explained to President Trump what he thought was happening. He lashed out on social media that this isn't right. We should not be seeing what we're seeing in Ukraine. So it's a combination of activists explaining to Republican officials, but also Americans with knowledge of what's happening in Ukraine. They need to talk to President Trump as well.
Moscow keeps using fake Ukraine hit us first excuses to cover up its war crimes. Is Trump still buying that old trick?
It's not so much whether he's buying it, but it seems that there are people in the circle of President Trump, whether it's official members of his administration or special representatives like Steve Witkoff. We know that Steve Witkoff has broken off conversations with Russia in person until there was any movement. He seems to be fully focused on Iran going forward and not sitting and meeting with Russian officials. For instance, he wasn't even involved in any potential talks in Turkey when that was happening. We know that the State Department had representatives, including Marco Rubio there, as well as Keith Kellogg now seems to be elevated back into a prime position to be a part of the negotiating team, as opposed to Steve Witkoff 2 months ago. We thought that was completely reversed. So this is what needs to be happening. We need to see the right people being involved in the negotiations, and the right people are the ones who visit Ukraine. Steve Witkoff has not, President Trump has not, J.D. Vance has not, and we need to, once they go to Ukraine, they can explain more cogently to President Trump what is happening, that these lies that President Putin is saying, the lies are self-evident if you simply watch online, but if you go to Ukraine itself, you see the lies directly. You see the children that are being targeted. You see the fact that an increasing amount of civilians have been targeted since President Trump took office. And that should be the number one fact that should be underscored for President Trump, that since he came to office, he is not helping the situation. Actually, the situation is getting worse.
And building on that, Trump didn't like what Zelensky said about the US being silent, and now he's pointing fingers. Is he really gonna walk away from Ukraine over that?
President Trump, I don't believe so, but this is part of a strategy. So the strategy needs to be much like sanctions. So I had a lot of conversations with American experts over the weekend, and also regular Americans, talking about sanctions and why sanctions don't work. And my explanation is that sanctions are just one weapon. We never use just one weapon when doing a broad strategy to cripple an opponent. This was a big problem in the air campaign against Yugoslavia in the 2000s. Also the air campaign against Libya and other nations more recently. You cannot rely on one playing field, one battlefield, to completely overwhelm your opponent. And so we cannot rely simply on sanctions. We need to increase military support. We need to increase diplomatic support, as well as supporting Ukraine's case for an international tribunal on war crimes. All of these things work together to pressure the enemy. Similarly, we can't rely just on good-natured relations between our two countries. Sometimes, from time to time, President Zelensky needs to point out that the facts aren't being recognized by the United States. He did this when Bridget Brink, the former ambassador, did not mention Russia in a social media post when she was still ambassador in Kyiv. Similarly, this time, he needs to point out that these massive attacks that have happened for 3 days in a row, where civilians are specifically being targeted, we cannot let that go as a nation and not point out directly to the Americans, what are you talking about? When Marco Rubio was testifying all of last week that we're making progress, we're clearly not making progress if these attacks are ramping up. So it's good that President Zelensky uses that selectively. It's not every day that he calls out the United States, but in this case, it definitely helps. And again, it's just one part of the entire scale of a attention campaign that needs to be constantly brought up in the West, constantly bringing up Ukraine, because the United States specifically will easily not talk about Ukraine for weeks at a time unless there is something coming out of Ukraine forcing the attention.
So I want to talk about weapon, because while the US is pulling back from talks and dragging its feet on more aid, Russia's making moves. But now we're seeing a shift. Western countries are lifting limit on long-range weapons. So what's the deal with those German Taurus missile? Are they finally coming or not?
I think this is part of this multi-vector campaign I was talking about. It can't be just sanctions. It can't be just America supplying weapons. And we know that it's been Ukraine developing its own weapons technology, developing weapons within Ukraine, as well as Europe stepping up and really increasing the percentage of weapons it's supplying. But specifically, that last 20% of weapons is what we're talking about here. The more high-tech weapons, the more lethal weapons when you go further downrange. We know that Ukraine has developed its own rockets of intermediate range. We know that its drones specifically have been targeting Russia at a very great distance. But it doesn't suffice to just have Ukraine do this alone. And it is incumbent upon the West to deliver some of these weapons. Even if it's in a limited capacity, we need to start doing these weapons in a way that can pressure Russia. Because again, we can't rely on just one aspect to pressure Russia. We can't just rely on sanctions, nor could we rely just on long-range weapons. These have to work in concert. We have to have the Czech initiative about getting shells from Ukraine. We have to have countries throughout the world, like we saw last year at the Peace Summit, sign onto basic agreements going forward. Ukraine should never be in a position where there is just one savior like the United States or another factor that is going to help it. It needs to have a broad coalition that's supplying it and supporting it. And it also has to have a broad means of weapons to use against Russia. That includes physical weapons, but also weapons of intimidation, such as diplomatic sanctions, as well as the threat of a future tribunal of war crimes.
Mm-hmm. If we put it simply, is Trump holding up a yellow flag or a red on right now? Is he ready to apply pressure and actually send weapons to Ukraine?
This will be the most important month for Ukraine diplomacy that we've had since last year. Last year, we had the Peace Summit, we had the G7, we had NATO anniversary all around the same month. Much like this, we have President Trump. Well, first he'll have his parade in June. But once he finishes those domestic things, he will have a couple of weeks of international visits. There's the potential for President Zelensky to meet alongside the G7 meeting that's happening in the third week of June. We know then the following week there will be the international visit to Brussels, to The Hague, for the NATO summit as well. Up until that time, beginning 2 weeks ago when we saw the meeting in Antalya, we know that the foreign ministers, including Marco Rubio, and as well as ministers like Andrij Dobriansky, who was in attendance there, even though Ukraine is not a NATO member, all working together to try to figure out what is the best formula for the NATO allies to come together. And so there will be a lot of work happening outside the public eye up until we see what happens at the NATO summit. But we also see very publicly the G7 meeting, what happens there, what statements are made, and if Zelensky meets with Trump there, as well as then the NATO summit. This will be, again, as consequential as last year. We had that big series of meetings in June of last year, including the reconstruction summit. We had the peace summit. We had the G7 and the anniversary of NATO. All of these events came together for progress diplomatically. It's not enough just to have one summit, but when you have multiple summits in a row, you can start a conversation at one with different leaders and then eventually come to where you wanted to come at the next summit. So this will be very important for all of Ukraine's diplomatic corps, all of our allies' diplomatic corps, and I assume that all of our viewers will be looking closely over the next month.